Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, this is the beginning of Book 4 of the Wolfman Chronicles, Part 38. This is Chapter 1, WAHEELA, A New Beginning, and this begins in Canada. The legend. The WAHEELA is a large, carnivorous, wolf-like creature that makes its home in Alaska as well as the Northwest Territories of Canada. It has a wider head than common wolves. It's extremely muscular with a heavy build. It has overly large feet and wide-spaced toes, long front legs, and shorter hind legs. The WAHEELA's fur is pure white, much like that of the polar bear or the Arctic fox, and it stands up to 4 foot high at its shoulder and it's up to 10 foot long, according to reports by those that have seen one. Now, witnesses claim to see only one WAHEELA at a time, leading one to believe that it's a solitary creature, except when it is time to mate. It is speculated that the WAHEELA may be a type of a prehistoric bear dog, or a dire wolf, or an entirely new species of wolf. It may be related to the medicine wolf of New Mexico, another very large all-white wolf with long, shaggy fur. The medicine wolf is sacred to the Apache and can only be seen by certain gifted persons. It just remains invisible to everyone else. Sasha sat in the passenger seat of the truck, reading a book titled Wolf, The Legends of Werewolves, Dogmen, and Other Furry Beasts. Jack loved listening to her voice as she read out loud. It was a pleasant way to pass some miles as they drove from Montana to Alaska. The 2 Australian shepherds slept in the back seat of the pickup, softly snoring. Everywhere were signs of spring. Warmer temperatures and longer days left occasional small patches of melting snow. Overhead, waterfowl were just beginning their migration north. Jack was not in a hurry. This great road trip to Alaska was like a rite of passage for him, a trip he could knock off his bucket list. And what better way to open up communication with Sasha than a long, scenic road trip? Now, the back of the pickup was filled with camping gear, a tent, a sleeping bag, cooking gear, just enough for some nice rustic camping. And it was perfect timing, just before summer with the onslaught of tourists. The shortest route from Montana to Alaska takes just about 2 days, but Jack planned on making a 10-day trip to travel the 3,113 miles, stopping at pristine mountain lakes with views of the Rockies, ghost towns and old mining towns left over from the 19th century gold rush days, and touring the world-famous breweries. They planned to visit the Athabasca Glacier and take the Parkway through Banff and Jasper National Parks to see the Canadian Rockies and the Wrangell Mountains. And they wanted to take a side trip to the Nahanni National Park Reserve in the Yukon, where the WAHEELA is said to hail from. He had no real destination in mind. This was merely a trip for unwinding from the past year and to reconnect with Sasha. After the wedding, Julian and Juanita were eager to return home and finalize their plans for their own wedding in August. Miguel was anxious to get back to his ranch. The 3 of them were driving back to Mexico, and with Miguel's connections, getting across that border would be a breeze. Catherine and Usko were flying to Norway for their honeymoon and to meet up with his mother's people for a small traditional ceremony there. Now, they were flying under assumed names with fake IDs to hide Catherine's identity. And now that she was pregnant and had changed her appearance by coloring her hair and putting on just a bit of weight, she looked like a completely different person. It felt safe enough, Jack decided, and he was happy for her to begin this new life as a married woman and a mother-to-be. Jack felt like all the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. It felt good to smile and laugh and hold Sasha in his arms again, even though he still kept a wary eye out for that Russian. He expected to see him at every roadside rest stop or turn up at every remote campsite, but so far there had been no sign of him. Sasha had hidden the stolen jewel under the seat, and they knew it would have to be dealt with sooner or later. But for right now, they both needed a few days of rest and relaxation. Sasha was different now. He surmised since her lengthy stint in the wolf's body, he felt closer to her after all they had been through, and he felt that finally he could trust her to tell the truth. She seemed as anxious to be rid of the past as he did, and now, as the miles drifted by, there was plenty of time for conversation. And for now, it was nice just to hear her read out loud to him. And so she read. Many of the members of the WAHEELA tribe of Alaska believe that the WAHEELA can be good or bad, depending on one's level of respect for the wildlife. There is a story of a man named Michael who was on a camping trip with a couple friends. Now, one of his friends got badly injured, so the two friends left to drive to the hospital, leaving Michael behind to pack up the camp in the dark. As he began to disassemble the tent, he heard something. He ran for his gun, and he heard another call, very distorted. He knew immediately it was a Wendigo. He had heard stories on the reservation that one had been recently sighted. He ran to the fire pit and threw more logs up on it, knowing it would not go out into the light. He thought he heard it leave, and not hearing any more noises, he decided it was just his imagination and began to pack up camp again. Suddenly, something pounced on his back. It had breath that smelled rotten as if it had eaten raw sewage. He felt a hot, stinging sensation go through his arm as the beast clamped his teeth onto it. Michael screamed in pain. He prayed that the Great Spirit would help him, and he knew he was about to die. Now the Wendigo flipped him over so that now he was facing the beast. It was pale as moonlight, with red eyes filled with hatred and sharp teeth dripping blood all over Michael's face. It held its head back and screeched. Michael just knew now he would be killed. Suddenly, the Wendigo started sniffing the air, and the look in its eyes turned from hatred to fear. Michael heard a growl coming from the trees. The Wendigo stood and looked around just as a giant white wolf stepped from the tree line. The Wendigo turned to run from it, but the wolf jumped on the Wendigo's back and tore the Wendigo's neck wide open. The Wendigo's body flew over the man and rolled right next to the fire. He could see that it no longer had a head. It had been ripped cleanly off the body. The WAHEELA's eyes were now fixed on Michael. But it did not attack. Instead, it walked on its four legs over to the Wendigo and snatched it with its mouth and carried it off into the woods. Michael began to cry in relief and realization that his prayers had been answered. He feels he was spared because of his respect for the wildlife. Sasha stopped reading and looked up from her book. You know what's interesting about this white werewolf, the WAHEELA? Did you know that the Ukrainian Security Service has a covert unit called the White Wolf Unit? They are known for targeting Russian positions and driving Moscow's forces underground in eastern Ukraine. They've discovered more than 800 Russian tanks and pieces of equipment. Hitler had his covert unit called the Werewolves, and now the Ukraine has the White Wolves. She laughed. Werewolves have played such an important part in history, but I never realized that they were real. And now, here we are, Jack, you and I, real werewolves. Jack looked over at Sasha and smiled. Real werewolves. It's still hard for me to believe as well. Along all the rest of them, Wendigos and WAHEELAs, Bigfoot, you might as well include fairies and leprechauns into that mix. They all sound like fairy tales until you're living the nightmare. Jack paused for a moment while he glanced once again in his rear-view mirror, making sure that they were not being followed. We'll be visiting the Nahanni River Valley where the WAHEELA is said to have originated. It's called the Headless Valley because of a legend where the WAHEELA is said to have decapitated several people. Maybe we'll get lucky and see one. Decapitated? Sasha asked. Sounds pretty grim. They mention it here in the book, as she continued to read. There are many stories of trappers and miners who went into the Nahanni River Valley and never returned. Back in the early 1900s, stories circulated across the country about the McLeod brothers after Charlie, Willie, and Frank McLeod returned from their gold panning trip 2 years prior. Frank and Willie decided to venture out again with an engineer by the name of Robert Weir. When 2 years passed and they didn't return, Charlie set out to look for them, but found only his brothers' decapitated bodies next to the Nahanni River. Their heads were nowhere to be found. The engineer, well, he was never seen again. Since then, dozens of people have unsuccessfully gone in search of the lost McLeod gold mine. Then, in 1917, another decapitated body was discovered. This time it was a Swiss prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen. He was found next to his burnt-down cabin near Flat River. In 1927, another body was discovered belonging to a man with the nickname of Yukon Fisher. His skeleton was found on the banks of Bennett Creek, quite close to the place where the bodies of the McLeod brothers were found in 1908. But the head was never found. And in 1945, an Ontario miner was found headless in his sleeping bag. Now, there have been at least 44 people who have either died or disappeared within this valley. According to indigenous legends, a giant white wolf-like creature called the WAHEELA may be responsible for the beheadings. The creature, known to tear people's heads off, wanders the wilderness and has supernatural strength. Sounds just like the place for a relaxing vacation, Sasha laughed. It sounds more like a Wendigo than a WAHEELA with the tearing off of the heads. Isn't that one of the trademarks of the Wendigo? The WAHEELA just sounds like another type of werewolf, only big and white. It does make me wonder, though, Jack replied, how many more are there like us? We can't be the only ones. How many more werewolves are there out there in the world? For as long as this legend has been told, there seems to always have been people who could transform themselves into wolves or other creatures. Shapeshifters, skinwalkers, cryptids of all kinds. I never believed in them until now, but how can you tell what is real and what's not? Vampires, Sasquatch, do they exist just because people believe in them, or do they exist at all? It's perplexing, and I'm beginning to feel the need to explore this possibility, to find others like ourselves. But how do you go about that? In Russia, we grew up with fairy tales. Some were unique to our country, but many were the same as what you would have grown up with. You see, Russia is rich with folklore and mythology, and we have cryptids as well. However, we do not use the word cryptid. See, we have several that are similar to the Bigfoot or the Yeti. The Almasty is a type of wild, hairy creature, and the Chuchanya, a man-like creature that lives in the Caucasus region. There's the Old Believers and all kinds of other hairy forest men, like lake monsters like the Loch Ness Monster, an electric or poisonous worm from Mongolia, and all sorts of magical animals from the myths of Siberia. In my house growing up, we had the Domove. They were house spirits. If you left vodka out for them, they would do your housework for you. And of course, the Baba Yaga, who was a witch that lived in the woods and had chicken legs. Sasha laughed. We were terrified of her. I believed my grandmother was the real Baba Yaga and just came to visit us in her human form. I was sure she would whisk me away to her forest home and eat me. Jack looked over at her and grinned. It was nice to see her laugh and talk about her childhood. He knew she was avoiding bringing up uncomfortable topics, such as how and when she acquired the Orlov diamond and what she intended to do with it. But he figured he'd give her some time. And this is what he hoped he had now. Time. Time to explore, time to relax, time to get to know each other again. When I grew up, Jack continued, we didn't spend any time believing in cryptids or monsters or fairy tales. We lived on a cattle ranch. There was always chores to do, fences to mend, horses to take care of, chickens, dogs, and barn cats. Our world was so full of livestock and hard work that we really never took the time to explore anything out of the ordinary. We'd sit down as a family on Friday night and watch a movie. So I knew about Frankenstein, Dracula, and I probably knew about aliens and UFOs, but it was just all fiction to me. I think that's why I had such a hard time accepting the idea that the Jaegers were really werewolves. It just didn't seem possible. Then when I started transforming into one, well, it just scared the hell out of me. That's why I went to Germany on that wild goose chase to find out more about them. I wanted to know what was happening to me, and then I met Professor Luther, and that's what started this whole mess we got in with Catherine and the Russians. He reached over and touched her arm. But it all led me to you, and I guess that's a good thing. You guess it's a good thing? She laughed. Catherine and Usko landed in Helsinki. One of his cousins was waiting at the airport with a car. Catherine was not feeling well, and they attributed it to the long flight. Standing outside the airport, she phoned Jack to let him know that they had landed, would now travel to Lapland, where they would meet up with Usko's mother and the other reindeer herders on their annual migration route. Jack noticed right away that something did not sound right in Catherine's voice. There was a hint of worry in her tone. Well, Cat assured him that she was fine, just feeling a little weary after the long flight, just eager to get some real food in her belly. The airline meal had been terrible. She agreed to keep Jack posted. We'll be out of cell range through much of the Canadian wilderness, so check in with Miguel, and I'll call you when we have the opportunity, Jack said. Well, Catherine agreed to that, ended the call, and began to walk to the waiting car where Usko was loading their luggage. As she stepped off the curb, she felt her knees go weak, her eyes fluttered, and a blackness descended in her vision. She fainted away and fell to the ground. The next thing she knew, Usko's arms were around her and he was lifting her up from the curb. What happened? Catherine asked. You fainted. Are you okay? Usko explained excitedly. Yes, I'm fine. I think I just need to eat. I'm sure it's just my blood sugar. Let's get out of here and find a restaurant. Usko helped her into her seat, and his cousin sped away from the airport in search of a diner. Miguel, Juanita, and Julian had just crossed the border into Mexico and had several more hours before they'd reach the ranch. The crossing had been smooth. Miguel's buddy in Deming, New Mexico, had arranged to get them across without any questions asked. It was so much easier to enter into Mexico than the other way around. Still, with Julian's warrant out for his arrest, they just couldn't take any chances. Miguel's phone rang. It's Jack, he said as he pushed the speaker button on the phone. Hey, Jack, how's that road trip going? Well, I'm sure it's much more scenic than yours. We entered into Canada yesterday afternoon and stayed in Banff National Park last night. We camped at an incredibly beautiful lake. Fish were jumping like crazy. You would have loved it. Now, we'll be heading into British Columbia soon and working our way up to the Yukon for a few days, so we're going to be out of cell phone range. Keep in touch with Catherine for me, okay? Miguel agreed to do so and wished them a safe travel. Stopping to let the dogs out and get a late lunch in Jasper, they decided to drive to Malign Lake in Jasper National Park to camp for the night. Now, Malign is considered the most beautiful alpine lake in Jasper, and one of the crown jewels of the Canadian Rockies. It is known not only for its beauty, but for its spectacular Spirit Island. It is a spiritual place for the Stoney Nakoda First Nation people who believe mountains are physical representations of their ancestors. The fact that Spirit Island is surrounded on three sides by the very same mountain range is very rare and makes it particularly significant to the Stoney. They believe everything has a living spirit. Humans, wildlife, rocks, water, mountains. Malign Lake is a living entity to them. And the Spirit Island provides the beating heart for the living lake, as well as a place for their spiritual ceremonies. Because it is a sacred spot, tourists, they're not allowed to set foot on this patch of land. It's connected by an isthmus to the mainland. Traditional ceremonies are held here, and artifacts, modern and ancient, call Spirit Island their home. Now, how do you suppose we go about seeing a WAHEELA? Jack teased as they set up their campsite. The Aussies were romping around, glad to be out of that truck at last. Jack threw the ball, and they both bounded off after it. The only way to get to Spirit Island is by boat, so Jack booked a sunset tour for he and Sasha. The dogs would have to stay back at the campsite. Although tourists are not allowed on the island, They are allowed to photograph the island from the boat or from short walks near the island. The scenery is worth it. The tour guide on the boat explained that wildlife was still abundant in the Malign River Valley. However, it's very rare to see a caribou. The caribou that live in Jasper National Park are part of a subset of woodland caribou herds called the Southern Mountain Caribou, and they're protected under the Species at Risk Act. 25 years ago, more than 800 caribou ranged in this national park, but today, few of the majestic animals remain. The Malign herd is now entirely extinct. The Tonquin and Brazeau herds do not have enough female caribou to grow new herds and are down to only a remaining few. In neighboring Banff National Park, woodland caribou are now extinct when the last 5 died in an avalanche near to Lake Louise. He then told a story of the enchanted white caribou, a local legend. It seems that a long time ago people had the power to turn into animals, and animals could turn into people. It was a time of magic. People had only to say what they wanted for it to come true. There was a young woman named Tiva who wandered far from home in search of driftwood, bones, and caribou antlers. A thick fog rolled in and she became lost. She was rescued by an Etisak, a young caribou hunter who brought her to his home. The next day, before he left to go hunting, he warned Tiva not to let anyone enter the tent. But she was tricked by an evil shaman who turned her into a white caribou. Etisak was very sad when he returned and found her gone. But the spirit of his grandmother, another powerful shaman, gave him the magic to break the spell. The next day, the young man headed out to hunt. He sought out the white caribou in the herd, recited the magic spell, and returned Tiva to her human form. Since then, hunters do not ever hunt the white caribou, as it might be an enchanted person. Jack and Sasha looked at each other and smiled. Magical enchanted shapeshifters seemed to be everywhere. Catherine felt a little better after she ate, but now, several hours later, the pain was coming back. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She didn't want to alarm Usko and thought it best to keep it to herself until the pain was so more than she could bear. It hit her like a baseball bat to the stomach. She found herself doubled over, clutching her belly. "I think something is wrong, Usko. We need to get to a doctor." Spasms had begun, and she felt her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Usko's cousin, Shar, assured them that once they reached the next village, they'd find a doctor or a hospital. "But I can't see a regular doctor," Kat protested. "Or I'm different. My blood is different from other people's blood." Shar raised an eyebrow at Usko, sitting in the back seat. He knew of Usko's bloodline, but he was not aware that Catherine also carried the blood of the wolf. "Hang in there, Kat. I know someone who can help in my mother's tribe. If you can just hang on till we reach them, she will know what to do for you." Usko quickly made a few phone calls, trying to get a message to his mother. Some of the Sami and the Nanette reindeer herders now carried cell phones, but it was rare to get service in the remote areas that they traveled through. They were used to a communication system of sending and receiving messages when they passed through a small village. The reindeer herders were constantly moving hundreds of miles per year. During the wintertime, they are in a forest area, and in the summertime, they are on the coast of the polar ocean. They migrate with the giant herds of reindeer. So the Nanette women are used to traveling while pregnant and giving birth in remote locations. It's called catching a child. These nomadic women have a traditional system of prenatal and postnatal care that's been practiced for centuries. Pregnant women are given the chaga mushroom for medicinal purposes. It is picked only during the winter and early spring in the forest areas where this specific mushroom can be found. They cut the chaga from the tree and collect it in a big sack. It is then packed in the sledges and used throughout the year. The women drink it in a tea and wash their face, hands, and body with the chaga tea. The remaining chaga is then splashed on the hot coals of the fire 3 times. It turns into a sauna which cleanses, purifies, and heals the pregnant women. Usco silently prayed to the sacred female helpers of all pregnant women in his mother's culture. The Janebia, the mother of the earth, and the Tuhaja, the protector of fire. These two sacred beings would keep her safe until they could reach his mother's tribe. Well, only a couple more hours and we'll be there. Usco brushed Catherine's hair away from her face and rubbed her shoulders. She was sitting in the front passenger seat, and he had moved over to sit right behind her. Her skin was hot to his touch. He was concerned that the plane ride might have done something. The altitude and the cabin pressure. Perhaps she had caught something from one of the passengers. God, if anything happens to her or our baby, I'll never forgive myself, he thought to himself, as he stared at the landscape passing by through the window. Catherine had drifted into a deep sleep. She dreamed she was walking through a dark, dense forest. Tall trees loomed overhead, and a few stars shone through the trees. Off in the distance she heard the cry of a wolf. The sound sent a chill down her spine, and she quickened her pace. The forest floor was uneven, covered in gnarled roots and fallen leaves that rustled underfoot. And as she ran, the shadows seemed to close in around her. The sense of being pursued grew stronger. Suddenly, she stumbled into a clearing bathed in an eerie silver light, where a large white wolf waited for her. Its piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and a strange calm washed over her, despite her lingering fear. The WAHEELA's presence was both majestic and intimidating, its long white fur glowing in the moonlight. Her pregnant belly swelled, and she realized the child she was carrying was somehow connected to this beautiful creature that stood before her. The WAHEELA, with its intense gaze, seemed to convey a message of protection and destiny. Catherine instinctively placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life within her respond with a gentle kick. She knew then that her child would be okay. It had the blood of the WAHEELA.